We will start. Okay, so this is a presentation called Mad, Bad and Dangerous to Know, a brief, subjective, angry history of romanticising artists' mental illness, self-harm and suicide. So, writing a romantic myth. Where does this term come from, and where does this cliche come from? The picture you can see here is Lord Byron, George Byron, 19th century poet, who many people will know. And he was described as mad, bad and dangerous to know by Lady Caroline Lamb, who was a contemporary of his. His father had been known as Mad Jack, suggesting that there was some kind of non-conformity in the family. But none of these things occur in isolation. So there was, at this time, there's a big growth of romanticism with capital R in the arts and culture as an outgrowth of and a reaction against the rationalism and industrialization of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And this is when it began to be thought that, as Caspar David Friedrich, the painter, said, the artist's feeling is his law. Previously, artists had not really been, well, they'd been creative, but they'd been generally regarded as a type of craftsman, not people that had their own sense of autonomy. So yeah, there's a lot of history here. I mean, if you can read it, please do in the time available. But the interesting thing here is that both were aristocratic writers. Caroline was partly a victim of the attitude towards women at that time. Some of her misbehavior, so-called, was due to her not conforming to social norms at the time. But she was fairly mad, bad and dangerous to know herself. She was what we would now call a stalker. She continued to stalk him, even though he had clearly cut himself off from her. She was an abuser of laudanum and alcohol. Yeah, and also it's important to know that Byron at the time was the kind of bisexual, social, artistic superstar at the time. And also these two were at the part of, this is the other thing that's quite interesting and important here, is that they weren't alone. They were at a nexus of they were in the nexus of a scene of influential figures, including Byron's daughter, Ada Lovelace, the pioneering computer programmer. They were friends with Percy Shelley, the poet, and Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, and Mary's mother, the pioneering feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft. So this is another key point in the development of the myth of artists being unstable and destroying themselves. Thomas Chatterton was a precocious but not that talented teenage poet who poisoned himself after moving to London to find fame but being rejected. He was mainly a pasticher, an imitator of medieval poets, and he wasn't that well known while he was alive. But afterwards, poets like Byron, Shelley, Wordsworth, the pre-Raphaelite painters, and later bohemians like Oscar Wilde, they took him up as a kind of icon of the tortured, misunderstood genius, which was the image that was coming through of artists in the 18th and 19th century. Yeah, at the same time, you have another reaction to the Industrial Revolution and globalization was what would later become existentialism and was at this time kind of nihilism. Friedrich Nietzsche, the idea that you could be a heroic loner in this godless world. God wasn't looking out for you, so you had to look out for yourself. And that there was this kind of heroism in going it alone. And Nietzsche talked about the Apollonian versus the Dionysian, which is control versus chaos, the repressed versus the expressed, making versus breaking. And again, this dichotomy can be seen in pre-Enlightenment artists who were about control, they were about repression, they were about making things. Increasingly, the view of the artist in the 19th and 20th century was that they created chaos. They expressed things that couldn't be expressed elsewhere, and that breaking things could be a form of art. Yeah, Nietzsche also, again, echoing on the dark side what Friedrich had said there are no beautiful surfaces without a terrible depth. This is a brief but relevant tangent when thinking about people's attitudes and behavior in the 19th and 20th centuries. From the Industrial Revolution to the middle of the 20th century, nearly everyone in the West was drunk or on drugs in their homes and workplaces. So even the poorest men, women, and children had low-cost access to alcohol, laudanum, chlorodyne, opium, chloroform, nicotine, heroin, amphetamines, and so on. Drugs were used medicinally and recreationally by people of all ages and classes. Masturbation and bicycle riding were considered more dangerous and morally hazardous in popular culture than using cocaine or heroin. During the Second World War, both sides of that war issued as standard amphetamines and methamphetamines, what we now call crystal meth, to their soldiers, including people who were flying planes. And after the war, these capitalist drugs were joined by drugs like ketamine, artificial opiates like Quaaludes, Valium, tranquilizers like Halcyon, which were all prescribed really widely and legitimately, and as well as being available as street drugs. So this is something that is very much tied up in the image of the artist as well, is that being bad and dangerous, no, part of it is that you abuse yourself. So yeah, this slide's called Came Back Haunted. It's interesting, if you saw the keynote that began yesterday's session, that talk mentioned that people who've suffered traumatic events and societies that have suffered traumatic events, they may recover, but they come back to a higher floor of anxiety and depression than they were at previously. So you get a kind of plateau on plateau kind of, I'm doing it the wrong way, it's hard to explain, plateau on plateau effect. And this was the experience that the painter Edvard Munch had. He said, yeah, you know my picture, The Scream, I was stretched to the limit. Nature was screaming in my blood. And after that, I gave up hope of ever being able to love again, which is melodramatic. But yeah, it explains that idea of what an artist should be. And he wrote himself on one of his paintings, can only have been painted by a madman, which may have been a joke. But again, it plays into that idea that artists are or have to be mad. And we come here to this question of value as well. The madder you are, the more you're worth. The last time a version of this painting was sold at auction, it cost £73.9 million. The outsider, this relates back to the Nietzschean idea of you being the heroic loner. Romanticism was intimately tied, often by the artists themselves, to the notion that being untutored, childlike, an actual child, savage in scare quotes, or even mad, might be preferable to being more authentic than being adult, educated, civilized, and acculturated, i.e. Apollonian. And again, you know, the wide availability of drugs and alcohol, you could easily make yourself mad and savage with drugs if you weren't lucky enough to be already organically mad or marginalized. Outside of folk, indigenous art and art brut continue to be lucrative, thriving markets and popular with the public, mainly after the artist's death. This is a cat painting by Louis Wayne. Another thing that's important to remember in terms of this romanticization is, what I call Trusterians of the Belle Epoque. Then, as now, because of the high barriers to entry, low pay, and limited genuine opportunities for advancement in prestige occupations like being an artist, musician, or writer, most artists actually worked in other jobs and earned a minority of their income from their art, which is still true today, despite the image of the artist being, you know, lazy, being in their garret, being creative, and all of this sort of stuff. Many of the now iconic artists, including Toulouse-Lautrec, Degas, Picasso, Cézanne, Van Gogh, Manet, Gauguin, Oscar Wilde, Virginia Woolf, hundreds of others, were supported by their families and inherited wealth. Most didn't advertise this. Those who lived in poverty and degradation, like Van Gogh, chose to and could usually reclaim their privilege whenever they wanted. What I'm calling here poverty cosplay. Lower middle class artists, let alone working class artists, were virtually unknown from the Enlightenment until mid 20th century and are still pretty rare. There's this idea that artists are better off dead, but largely because of the value of their work goes up and the appreciation of their work often goes up. VVG gave away many of his works as gifts, but only sold very little while he was alive, and those mainly through his brother Theo calling in favours. His brother Theo was an art dealer. They're valued now at between $60 and $100 million each, when they're rarely available for sale, and often stolen as well. And again, this famous painting by VVG of his bedroom is the Victorian equivalent of an Instagrammer celebrating their sort of peasant lifestyle. It's yeah, shabby chic, peasant chic. Yeah, and this was his fate. Dead at 37. He was an alcoholic, suffered from some kind of mental illness, probably bipolar disorder, psychosis. There's the famous incident with the ear. And he did a kind of, well, sort of botched suicide. He didn't die immediately, died some time afterwards. So yeah, moving into the 20th century, people like Franz Kafka were already onto the idea of artists' poverty and artists' mental illness being something that was both a real problem and potentially a pose. A story, A Hunger Artist from 1924, is about an artist who is part of a society where it's fashionable to starve yourself and for other people to watch you starve. But when that goes out of fashion, he starves himself privately anyway, eventually dying with nobody looking at him and no audience. Again, you know, we think of Instagram again, and the way that has been related to a huge increase in body dysmorphia and eating disorders. Kafka himself worked in an office, and his writing was mostly unpublished while he was alive. And yeah, ironically, he died of starvation because he had laryngeal TB, and it was too painful for him to eat. So going into the 20th century, we see increasing kind of cosplaying of authenticity, poverty, and marginalization. The beatniks are one example of it, and the much maligned London hipsters and New York, Williamsburg hipsters of the 21st century are examples of this. They're people with usually a lot of money, pretending to be poor, pretending to be mad, abusing both prescription and non-prescription drugs. And this is a lifestyle and an aspirational lifestyle. This is from the 90s, the Britpop era. Again, Jarvis Cocker's lyrics here, you can read them for yourself. But again, we're talking about cosplaying authenticity, poverty, and marginalization here. She came from Greece. She had a thirst for knowledge. She studied sculpture at St. Martin's College. Yeah, as somebody who's been in the art world, yeah, I've met this person many times over in different ages and genders. They're still here. It's a thing. So yeah, this is just a really quick thing that summarizes the elements of this stereotype as I see it. So living and dying the stereotype, creativity, authenticity, being real, individualism, alienation and angst, a scene, i.e. being part of a group of similar people, sex and sexuality, drama and controversy, again, creating it often for yourself, the media, which amplifies the drama and the controversy, mental illness, which is something which often correlates with artistic people, self-medication, often for traumatic events or one's own mental illness, tragedy, and the idea that you live forever by dying, so that, you know, the best artist is a dead artist, which leads to some neglect of living artists. So again, this is another really quick section. All the creative people from the 20th century I could think of off the top of my head who had a mental illness and killed themselves. I'm going to dwell on this one just very slightly. This is Sarah Kane. I knew Sarah. We worked together. She had clinical depression and she killed herself while she was in hospital. But these are the other people that also came to mind after Sarah. Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, Mark Rothko, Ernest Hemingway, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, Carrie Fisher, Mike Nelson, Keith Flint, Alexander McQueen, and Robin, whose surname I've forgotten, Robin Williams, and David Foster Wallace, the author, Spalding Gray, performance artist. And this is all the creative people from the 20th century I could think of off the top of my head with a mental illness and didn't kill themselves. None whatsoever. So, yeah, in this section, I'd like to invite some participation. These are 12 rhetorical questions and statements you may wish to answer anyway. So I'm going to run through these with you, and Verity she's ahead of me. Thanks, Verity. So yeah, we're going to just have a few seconds to answer these, but they'll be open for the rest of the afternoon. So I'd like to get some really unvarnished, unthought through responses. Am I dangerous to know because I'm mad, or mad because I'm dangerous to know.
You can find a link to this in the chat, by the way.
Yes, thank you. It's also written on the site itself, menti.com, and use the code 30375680.
There's usually a slight delay as comments come in, so if you just send those, here we go. Some are coming in.
Okay, I see a comment that's just popped up here. Yeah, I'd really like knee-jerk responses. Processing is a good response too. And again, you can come back to these later if you wish. So the next one. Mad people are usually more bad and dangerous to themselves than they are to other people. I forgot to mention as well, this is very personal to me, mentally ill person myself here. How about the next one? Am I an artist because I'm mad, or am I mad because I'm an artist? The latter. Yeah, the two. Yeah, we're being reductive here. That's the exercise. Okay, next. Being an outsider, not getting the help you need, and destroying yourself only seems cool if it's not you. Yeah, well, yeah, that's a very good question. Why does the idea persist that this is glamorous? That's so I don't know the answer, but yeah, that's something that I've definitely been getting at with this presentation. Next one, please. There is nothing less productive or creative than not being able to be yourself, know yourself, and think clearly. Yes, imposter syndrome is a good thing to bring up, actually. Yes, you know, that's the sort of flip side of the artist pose, isn't it? It's like when you're doing the pose but you don't even believe your own pose. Yeah, that's a good point, and tragic. Next slide, please. What is the self? That's a good response, but we don't have time for that. Being an artist is a full-time job. Maybe that one's so rhetorical there's no responses. Oh, okay, here we go. If only it paid like one. Yes, exactly. Yeah, again, we could go into a whole other thread of the poverty of artists and the impact that has on their mental health. Next slide, please. Being mentally ill is a full-time job. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and getting back to some kind of wellness is a full-time job too, and an exhausting one. Yeah, next one, please. Multitasking our lives and work is sometimes necessary, but nobody thrives on multitasking. Yes, capitalism. Multitasking is the death of creativity. Somebody disagrees? The singularity, question mark? Well, yeah, I've sometimes been so busy and exhausted, I felt like I'm leaving my physical body, but I'm not sure that's what you mean. Next one, please. Why is there an inverse correlation between how much we want and value an occupation and how much we pay and support people to do it for us? Somebody mentioned previously the low pay and no pay of artists. Yes, again, bloody capitalism. All right, can we move on? I don't know what number we're at. Oh yeah, we're near the end. Do I need help right now? Well, that can, yes, there's two meanings there. That can mean, do I need help right now? But that can mean, do you need help right now? The next one. In the event of an emergency, first make sure your own oxygen mask is fitted correctly. That's really true. Yeah, easy to say, hard to do. Especially if your natural instinct is to help. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can't support other people if you're a wreck yourselves. Next. Do I know anybody who needs help right now? And again, that means, do I? Do you? Can be yourself. Next. Oh, that's the end. So yeah, that'll do. Yeah, I've got a minute left. So yeah, I'm just going to thank you for your attention. Thank you for your interaction. And when this session is finished, there will be some resources available if, as they say on the BBC, you've been affected by any of the issues raised in this presentation. There will be some links for places you can get help and support for your mental health and general well-being. So yeah, that'll do. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.